ITN News at 10 with Trevor McDonald.
Voting now in the Commons on the critical motion of confidence. Enemies finally catch up with Dahmer, the serial killer. Tension grows as allies fall out over Bosnia. And how the jackpot will help out with the weekly pension. Good evening. On a crucial night for the government at Westminster, MPs are voting now on the first of two measures on Britain's payments to the European Union. The Cabinet says the government will resign if it's defeated. That now looks unlikely. Up to 9 Tory rebels may abstain, but they won't go as far as voting against. Even so, they'll lose the Conservative whip, and that means, in theory, that the government will lose its majority. Let's go now to our political editor, Michael Brunson, who is at Westminster.
Trevor, you're right. The talking has stopped. The voting is now underway. And as you also said, the government will not lose the vote. But what this does in the way that the country, that ordinary voters perceive this government, perceive John Major's leadership, that may be the real story out of all this. Because the bitterness that there's been around today has been very plain for all to see. Bitterness in the party of what the rebels have been doing. Bitterness among the Eurosceptics who aren't rebelling tonight, but among the rebels themselves, extreme bitterness. Richard Shepherd in the debate, for example, one of them saying, the government needn't think that by stuffing my mouth with gold or withholding the whip, they can alter the first trust in a democracy between an MP and his constituency. As the day went on, the determination of the rebels seemed to harden. Two of them, Theresa Gorman and Christopher Gill, launched a pamphlet with the provocative title, Not a Penny More, to Europe, of course.
I have never, ever voted for more money for Europe since I have been a member of this House, and I am not starting today.
But opening the debate, the Chancellor said the extra money for Europe was totally justified.
And that increase in the contribution is an increase in the price that we pay for the undoubted benefits of membership of the European Union.
And then began a pretty disagreeable afternoon with the divisions in the Tory party paraded for all to see. Yes, said the Chancellor, there was just one member who objected to the Edinburgh Summit deal at the time, Theresa Gorman. That comment pleased her. But one by one, other rebels began to attack the extra money now required.
It was first of all presented as being a little measure, and then when it became necessary to bash it through with a quite unnecessary element of confidence added to it. And the country began to ask, why are you blackmailing your backbenchers for 75 million?
Well, of course, the Chancellor took issue with that.
I also would not seek to blackmail my honourable friend, but I would seek to persuade him that his conscience, his lifelong commitment to the Conservative Party, and his sense of proportion about this issue and his sense of this country's duty to keep its word when it enters into commitments with our partners in the European Union could still lead him to support this bill tonight with no question of having his arm twisted at all.
But the opposition parties were quick to seize on the fact that it was the Prime Minister, listening to but not speaking in the debate, who had made it all a vote of confidence.
He's told the House for him it's a matter of confidence. He's told the House that every clause is a vote of confidence. But the man who has asked for a vote of confidence from this House has not the confidence to stand up in this House and ask for that vote.
They don't have confidence, Mr. Deputy Speaker, in themselves on this issue, and therefore they shouldn't look to the opposition party to express any confidence in them either.
And how far the Tory discontent goes was underlined as the former Chancellor, Norman Lamont, talking of the Cabinet's suicide pact, offered his opinion
that the issuing of suicide threats is a classic cry for help. It's in that spirit... It's in that spirit that I would like to help the government tonight.
But the speech didn't really help at all.
I have become persuaded that we in this country have to consider all options if we cannot negotiate a special relationship between Britain and our partners, including even withdrawal.
And tonight, the harshness of confidence votes. Julian Critchley brought in by taxi, but then seen walking painfully on crutches to a waiting wheelchair to be here to pass through the lobbies. The seriously ill Geoffrey Dickens is also here tonight. Well, now, once that voting is completed, and there'll probably be 2 votes, the whips, of course, will go through those division lists. Now, if the 9, and I think they are, the Richard Boddy, Nicholas Budgeon, Christopher Gill, Theresa Gorman, Tony Marlow, Richard Shepherd, Bill Taylor, John Wilkinson, and perhaps Bill Walker. If they have not voted and abstained, they will then be called in one by one to see the Chief Whip tonight. Could go on until around midnight, 1 in the morning. But it is entirely possible that those 9 people by tomorrow morning will not be Conservative MPs. Back now to the studio.
So, as Mike Brunson said, where does tonight's vote leave the rebels and, more importantly, the government? Our political correspondent Adrian Britton reports.
A risk worth taking is how rebel Christopher Gill describes the prospect of losing the whip and therefore effectively descending into political isolation.
I just simply take the view that if I have the whip withdrawn, it'll be the government's loss, not mine.
But Mr. Gill, like the other rebels, will encounter severe losses. They'll be banned from voting in a leadership contest against John Major, banned from taking part in party activities in Parliament, and most seriously, could face deselection by their constituency associations. No MP can stand for their party at a general election if they've lost the whip. Persuading those rebels to step into line is the job of heavyweight whip David Lightbound, who in a rare interview said his tactics varied.
They're not all sticking them up against the wall and putting them in. I sometimes kiss them better.
The last MP to have the whip withdrawn was Tory Rupert Allison a year ago, before coincidentally failing to support the government in a crucial Euro vote.
Did my time, took my porridge, and after a year I was restored to the whip.
Having the whip withdrawn can be a brutally swift process. Rebels could be hauled before the chief whip before they're allowed home tonight. But the government could be the eventual loser, because by effectively suspending MPs from the party, they could in theory be reducing their narrow majority. Adrian Britton, News at 10, Westminster.
And the result of the first vote at Westminster will be known in a few minutes' time. Since the division bell sounded, MPs have been arriving at the Commons. We'll be returning there for that result as soon as it happens. Now tonight's other news, the American serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer, whose crime shocked his country and the world, was found battered to death today in the prison in Wisconsin. Dahmer was serving several life sentences for the gruesome murders of 17 young men and boys. Our Washington correspondent Bill Neely reports.
Jeffrey Dahmer's violent life ended in a brutal attack on a prison bathroom floor, beaten to death by a fellow prisoner. He had been cleaning toilets next to a basketball court when the inmate attacked, hitting him on the head repeatedly with a broom handle. Officials say Dahmer died of massive head injuries. Another prisoner with him was also beaten. Jeffrey Dahmer's confession 3 years ago stunned America. He admitted murdering 17 young men and boys, most of them lured from gay bars, drugged and then killed. But it was the manner of their death that was most shocking. Some were injected with acid, all were dismembered. Detectives found severed heads in his refrigerator. He used other body parts, some found in a large pot, for sex and cannibalism. He said he killed to keep his victims from leaving him.
I deserve whatever I get because of what I have done.
Dahmer had shown remorse for his crimes, apologizing at the end of his trial.
I did what I did not for reasons of hate. I hated no one.
The victims' relatives who screamed abuse at him then are unhappy today that his prison life is now over.
The hurt is worse now because he's not suffering like we are.
Today's assault was the second time Dahmer has been attacked in jail. 4 months ago, an inmate tried to cut his throat in the prison chapel. In prison, Dahmer spoke openly about his killings.
But I managed to go to work, conduct myself just like anyone else would.
His lawyer said today that Dahmer had a death wish. Dahmer said he would kill again if given a chance. Today, brutally, that chance was extinguished. Bill Neely, News at 10, Washington.
We're taking an early break now to bring you the results of that crucial Commons vote on the EU budget. Live coverage from inside the chamber as that vote happens. Also, men who won't pay maintenance are offered cut-price paternity tests, but will it make any difference? And hitting the jackpot, the pensioners with over £1.5 million to spend.
I'm buying my grandson a new car. That's the first thing I'm going to do.
anni non mi è mai sembrato che sapesse la mancanza di monarchia.
Monday. It makes all the difference. New Andrex. It's squeezably softer and thicker than ever.
What's the verdict, then?
It's coming along nicely. I'm not sure if all that standing about in rivers is going to be such a good idea, huh?
You sound like my daughter.
Ever thought about taking up golf?
Why not? Why not?
Here you are, Dad.
Good morning. I see you give lessons. Good. Excellent. I am rather old.
Right. Let's see what sort of swing you've got.
Something like this? Only joking. I think I'm going to enjoy this.
Let's shoot.
Whatever you call it, you feel better with Beecham's.
Accurist Navigator. Travel the world's time zones with 3 international alarms. Accurist Divers. Water resistant to 20 atmospheres. Accurist Sport. A chronograph performance captured at 2/100ths of a second. Accurist. The standard by which all watches are set.
I want to fly from Manchester to New York. I want a chauffeur-driven service door to door. I want world-class service that doesn't cost the earth. I want
Aer Lingus Premier Service. Manchester, Shanghai, New York, from December the 2nd. Now, shouldn't you be flying with us?
Now, the result of the first of tonight's 2 important confidence votes on Britain's contribution to Europe is about to be announced. This vote is on the Labour amendment proposed by the Shadow Chancellor Gordon Brown. It says higher contributions must be accompanied by government action to cut fraud and waste in the European Union. Now, let's go to the chamber and to our political correspondent there, Peter Murphy. Peter, can you hear me?
And here in the Commons, we're waiting for the result. We're waiting for the tellers. These are the people who count the votes on either side to come back and tell us exactly what the score is. The vote itself, this is the first vote, is on Labour's amendment, which calls for action to cut fraud and waste before contributions can be put up. So it's the opposition that will be voting aye, and it's the government that will be voting no. And the first group of tellers are coming back in, Sidney Chapman and Ray Powell. Sidney Chapman, a government whip, handing over his result to one of the Commons clerks. Ray Powell, a Labour whip, coming in as well. And now, from the other end, we have the other 2 whips coming in with their result. They will now line up in front of the Speaker, and the result will be read out. I see it's just been handed to the Prime Minister, so he knows exactly what the result is as well. The whips are now going back to line up in front of the mace, in front of Madam Speaker, and will read out the result. Then it'll be handed to the Speaker, Betty Boothroyd, who will repeat it. The result of that first vote.
The ayes to the right, 303. The noes to the left, 330.
So, an easy victory for the government.
303. The noes to the left, 330. The noes have it. Order. Unlocked.
So that's the result of the first vote, a government majority of 27, 303 to 330. and there appear to have been 7 Conservative abstentions. Teresa Gorman, Teddy Taylor, Richard Shepherd, Nick Budgeon, Tony Marlow, Christopher Gill and John Wilkinson all sat on their hands during that vote. And now MPs are going out to vote for the second time. This second vote is on the European Community's Finance Bill itself, whether or not it should have a second reading. The Labour Party are going to abstain, so the government's majority should be even larger on this second vote.
And we'll have more from the Commons on that second vote later. Now, Mr. Major may not be the only one trying to maintain unity over Europe tonight. Exit polls in Norway are suggesting that the result in the referendum on EU membership is very much in the balance tonight. Early forecasts suggest the trend is towards a close no vote. The Norwegian government has been leading the campaign for the yes vote. Ian Glover-James at ITN has this report.
Tonight, Norway is on a knife edge, with exit polls showing yes and no votes in the referendum to join Europe hanging in the balance. This tiny country of 4 million is split down the middle. Norway's Prime Minister Gro Harlem Brundtland leads the yes campaign, fearing Norway will be left behind by her Scandinavian neighbours if voters reject Brussels for the second time in 22 years.
I believe that the clear sky indicates that the clear mind will discover it. And the clear heart, you know, it is a question of both heart and mind. Should we do something together with others, or should we be isolated and turn our backs on other countries?
But that view carries mainly in Oslo and the south, where polls show people will vote to join Europe. The further north you go, the no campaigners hold sway. Many Norwegians simply fear their high standard of living will be eroded by Brussels. The oil revenues, which make Norway rich, also support expensive social welfare programs. That's why voters in Tromsø and the far north said no by more than 70%, according to exit polls.
I voted no. Why? Because it's what my stomach tells me to do. Yeah, it's my feelings.
I will vote yes.
Why?
I think about the future for my kids.
Tonight, no campaigners were confident they'd won, but the official verdict will take longer, and gloom in the yes camp may be premature, so close is Norway's split on Europe.
Britain and the United States clashed head-on today over the handling of the B-hatch crisis. The Senate Republican leader Robert Dole accused Britain of being mostly to blame for the NATO failure to halt the Serb advance. The Defense Secretary, Malcolm Rifkin, said it ill became people in countries without troops on the ground to criticize. 63 British peacekeepers are still being held by Serb forces. Here's our diplomatic editor, James Mates.
Serb forces appear to have slowed their advance into the B-hatch pocket, but there is widespread acceptance now that they can capture the town anytime they like. They have ignored its status as a safe area. They have ignored the full might of the UN and NATO. And in their humiliation, the Western allies are squabbling amongst themselves. The most powerful senator in the United States blames Britain for the failure in Bosnia and is wondering aloud whether NATO has any further purpose.
My view is that the President's going to have to take the lead. He's going to have to stop relying on the United Nations and start looking at whether we're going to be a part of NATO, whether we ought to bring the troops home.
While Europe's foreign ministers were meeting in Brussels, Defense Secretary Malcolm Rifkin was hitting back at Washington.
I think those in Congress who use that language are behaving disgracefully. I think it will become people in countries that have not provided a single soldier on the ground to make that kind of criticism.
That the very future of NATO might be at stake over the Bosnian tragedy clearly focuses European minds. The new Secretary General of NATO rushed to the alliance's defense, pointing out that it can only act at the behest of the UN.
Please don't criticize NATO when NATO is respecting the rules of the game. We are not, I repeat it, in a leading position.
And anyway, insisted the Foreign Secretary, NATO could not do what the Americans wanted to without sending in a huge army.
It's an illusion, and as I said this morning, a cruel illusion, to suppose that NATO from the air can determine the outcome of this war.
The dangers to an army on the ground, even a peacekeeping army, are all too familiar to British troops there. They are still waiting for the release of 63 of their colleagues who were detained by the Serbs at the weekend. Their freedom was promised at lunchtime today, but there's still no sign of that happening.
2 High Court judges made a ruling today which could change controversial appeal hearings. The first people to benefit should be the three men still in jail for murdering newspaper boy Carl Bridgewater 16 years ago. Their relatives were at the High Court today to hear the result. They said it meant the three men should be freed next year. The child support agencies to offer cheap DNA blood tests to men who deny their absent fathers. It follows concern that many men refuse to tell the truth to avoid paying maintenance. They'll have to pay for the test, but if it proves they're not, in fact, the father will be reimbursed. Anya Sitaran has the details.
The CSA today invited bids for cut-price DNA testing to try and settle the backlog of 6,000 cases where paternity is in dispute. Men would have to pay for a blood test, currently £140, but would get their money back if it proved negative. The government hopes this will avoid lengthy and expensive court action.
There are really fathers in existence who know the paternity of their children full well and are denying it because they think by doing so they will somehow get back at the CSA. They don't. What they do is to disturb the child, build up bigger arrears for themselves and make life more difficult for the mother.
Where's the boy?
3-year-old Shakira Jupp is at the centre of a paternity dispute. Her mother hopes a DNA test will prove her parentage once and for all.
Men have been denying their children for far too long, and it's about time they stood up and faced their responsibilities.
Absent fathers whose test proved positive will still have the legal right to deny paternity, but if they lose in court, they'll face hefty legal fees.
I haven't met any so-called feckless fathers yet. In reality, they were paying maintenance, and it seems that what the government have done is to go in on those who are already paying. And what they're trying to do now is to mop up more of the cases where people have found apparent loopholes.
With figures suggesting 1 in 10 parents won't cooperate with the CSA, this is a move by the beleaguered agency to try and improve its performance.
As we saw a moment ago, things are going the government's way on tonight's European budget vote. Tomorrow at Westminster is, of course, the Chancellor's proper budget speech. Our economics editor, Ruth Lea, examines the driving forces which will shape what the Chancellor does.
Tomorrow afternoon, Kenneth Clark will step into his Red Rover and drive to Westminster. He'll only be chauffeured a few hundred yards to deliver his budget speech, but we decided to go a little further and use a Rover like the Chancellor's for a longer tour and see how the engine that powers his car is a little like the engine that's driving Britain's economic recovery. Like the Rover, the economy needs to be steered with considerable care, and that means keeping a fine balance between the accelerator and the brakes, without overheating it and without bringing it to a complete halt. The engine of recovery is powered by 4 motors of expenditure. The biggest of these is consumer spending, what people spend in the high street. But this is slowing down as Mr. Clark has already applied the brakes. The high street has already felt the effects of this year's big tax increases and September's rise in interest rates. There's more braking to come with higher taxes due next year, unless Mr. Clark changes his mind tomorrow. And interest rates will probably go up further over the next 2 years to keep the lid on inflation. But this power behind the engine mustn't be allowed to slow down too much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
2 really big spenders are central government and local government. They pay for schools, roads, defence and the NHS, including new hospitals. The first phase of this new hospital at Barnet in North London is costing £28 million. But Mr. Clark is concerned about the size of public borrowing. Last year it was some £800 for each man, woman and child. He needs to keep tight control over government spending. If he does cut back spending, he'll be applying the brakes and restricting growth. But it's industry spending on factories and machinery that's vital for the prosperity of the country. There are signs now that it's picking up. If he does cut back public spending, he'll be applying the brakes and restricting growth. The best thing Mr. Clark can do for manufacturing companies is to keep the engine of economic growth running smoothly. Industrialists are only likely to raise their capacity when they see good long-term prospects for both their products and the economy as a whole. The fourth and final force driving the economy is foreigners' spending, in other words, the export trade. Here the Chancellor has little room for manoeuvre. In recent months, exports have been booming, thanks to strong demand from America and Europe. This is very good news. It stops the economy stalling at a time when people in Britain are cautious, government outgoings are being reined in, and factory spending has yet to show any large increases. Here the Chancellor can try and keep the pound competitive and hope that the economies overseas continue to grow. Mr. Clark's challenge is to keep the engine of growth ticking over. To succeed, he will need fine judgment on taxes and spending tomorrow in his budget, and not a little luck. Ruth Lea, News at 10, Central London.
ITN will bring you the budget speech live tomorrow afternoon with instant and expert analysis of what it all means. Budget 94 tomorrow at 3:20 on ITV. Cricket news, and England resumed their second innings in Brisbane in less than 2 hours' time, needing a record-winning total of 508 to clinch the first test. They need another 297 runs. They have 8 wickets standing, and they have an entire day's play. The heroes of the day were Hick and Thorpe. Hick finished unbeaten on 72. Thorpe wasn't far behind. He was 66, not out at the close. 8 pensioners who won £1.7 million on the national lottery talk today of their plans for the future. Far from splashing out on plush new homes, they plan to continue living together in the same block of flats in Buckinghamshire. The 7 women in the syndicate were asked if they might now have a problem with male admirers. We've always done, they said. Vernon Mann reports.
The lottery's first £1 million prize-winning syndicate got their cheque this afternoon. 1 minute Newport Pagnell, next celebrity photo calls outside the Dorchester. Have you been to the Dorchester before?
No, never. No, it's an experience. Yeah.
What are you going to do with all the money?
I don't know. I'm buying my grandson a new car. That's the first thing I'm going to do.
Brilliant. What about yourself? Anything for yourself?
I haven't thought of that.
They were enjoying every minute of it, still surprised at the amount they'd won.
Very surprised. Never dreamt it.
Fred Baker organised it all.
And we said, how about us doing a lottery? And I said, give me all your numbers, give me all your £1 each, and I'll do it for you. And I did.
And you did. What was it like in the house on Saturday night?
Bedlam.
Fred's going on a cruise. Some of the ladies might go with him, but they'll stay together in their block of flats. Vernon Mann, News at 10 at the Dorchester Hotel.
And we're going back to Westminster now, where the implications of the abstentions by around 7 rebels are being assessed. This is the scene in the chamber now, as MPs prepare to hear the result of the vote on the government motion. But the critical vote went the government's way earlier. They had a majority of 27. Let's go now to our political editor, Michael Brunson, who is outside the Commons. Mike, so the vote has been won, but at what damage to the party, you think?
Well, as I was saying earlier, what we saw today was the split in the Tory party over Europe on the fullest possible parade to public view. Not just the 7, and it is 7, I can confirm, we'll come on to that in a minute, not just the 7 people who abstained, but all the other Eurosceptics like Bill Cash and Norman Lamont, who got up also and said their piece. Now, as for the 7, I had a list earlier, you remember, of 9. The top and bottom of that list, in the end, did vote for the government. So Richard Boddy did, and so did Bill Walker. But the following, Nicholas Budgeon, Christopher Gill, Theresa Gorman, Tony Marlow, Richard Shepherd, Bill Taylor and John Wilkinson, they now will almost certainly be called in a very short time to see the Chief Whip, and they will have the whip taken away from them, which means that they are no longer officially Conservative MPs, and if they don't change, and if the whip isn't given back to them by the time of the general election, they won't be able to stand as Conservative candidates.
Mike, you talked about the mood of bitterness around Westminster today, especially in the Conservative Party. Is this mood likely to lead, you feel, to the possibility now of a leadership challenge?
Well, on balance, one has probably got to say no. See, what the government is going to make a great deal of is that they did win by 27 votes. Now, of course, that's a lot better than certainly 1 or 2 of those crucial votes. Remember, they actually lost a vote during the Maastricht process, and the others were narrow. There was a vote of 3 votes in it, I remember. So the government is going to say, well, there's no reason why we should have any problem. There's no reason to challenge the Prime Minister, because what he did at Edinburgh has now, 2 years on, been vindicated. But on the other hand, as I was saying earlier, the extent of the bitterness in the party, even on the left wing of the party, and talking to people on that side of it who said, my goodness me, look at the state we're in. Look at what all this says about John Major's leadership. So they may be tempted. I don't think they'll get the 34 votes required, but they may be tempted.
Michael Brunson at Westminster, thank you very much. And that's News at 10 tonight. We're back tomorrow, Budget Day. From all of us here at ITN, good night.